Yes, I am back with another fantastic session. This is Santosh Sahu and you are watching Sahu's tutorial, and this video is going to deal with a brief introduction to New Zealand literature. And why so? Because in many state exam you will get question from New Zealand literature. Recently WB set was conducted on 8th January. There was a question that who was the first New Zealand writer to win the Booker Prize, and it was Carrie Hume who won the Booker Prize for her novel The Bone People that was published in the year 1984. The Bone People that was published in the year 1984, and it was Carrie Hume, Kerihulme. So she was the first person to win the Booker Prize for her The Bone People, the novel that was published in the year 1984. So before starting the session, I would like to request all of you, please keep subscribing South's tutorial and hit the like button and share with your friends and tap the bell icon to get more notification about the videos that I will upload in future. So let's begin the session with this first slide, that is New Zealand literature, the introduction. New Zealand literature is literature both oral as well as written, produced by the people of the New Zealand, and it often deals with the New Zealand themes, people or places, and is written predominantly in New Zealand English. So it was oral as well as written, produced by the people of the New Zealand. It often deals with New Zealand themes, people as well as the places, and it was predominantly in written in New Zealand English. And the thing that you will have to remember is that it features Maori culture. It features what? Maori culture and the use of the Maori language before the arrival and the settlement of the Europeans in New Zealand. So before the arrival and the settlement of the Europeans in New Zealand in the 19th century, Maori culture had a strong oral tradition. Maori culture had a strong oral tradition. Early European settlers wrote about their experiences traveling and exploring New Zealand. So the people who were the European settlers who went there, and they experienced their traveling while they were doing traveling, and they were while they were exploring New Zealand. So those experiences were written by them. So they were the early European settlers. The concept of New Zealand literature as distinct from English literature did not originate until 20th century. It did not originate until it did not came into existence until 20th century, when the authors began exploring the themes of landscape, yani the landscape, the New Zealand landscape, isolation, and the emerging New Zealand national identity. And the Maori writers became more prominent in the latter half of the 20th century, and Maori language and the culture have become an increasingly important part of New Zealand literature. So this is Maori writers and Maori language. Those things were very important in New Zealand literature. Many New Zealand writers have obtained local as well as international renown over the years, and they are the short story writers like Catherine Mansfield, who is famously known for her for the short story The Prelude. Frank Sargeson, Jack Storm. They are the famous short story writers like Catherine Mansfield, Frank Sargeson, and Jack Storm. Okay, now move to the next slide here. Novelists like Janet Frame, V.T. Imaria, Carrie Hume. I told that Carrie Hume won the first Booker Prize for her novel, that is The Bone People, that was published in the year 1984. Then Owen Mulligan, Patricia Grace, Moiras Gee, and Eleanor Catton. So these were famous novelists of New Zealand literature. Now, who are the best poets? James K. Baxter, Fellow Adcock, Selina Tuskala-Mers, and Hone Tuar. They're the best famous poets of New Zealand literature. Children's authors like Margaret May and Joy Cowley. Like historians, Michael King, Judith Binney, and playwright were Roger Hall. Now, early works, that is pre-1870s. Now, who are the Polynesian? Polynesian settlers began arriving in New Zealand in the late 13th or early 14th century and became known as Maori. So they became known as Maori, who were the Polynesian settlers. The Polynesian settlers became known as Maori, developing as distinct, a very different culture, including what? Oral myths, legends, poetry, songs, and prayers. Maori did not have a written language until the early 20th century. So they did not have a written language. Whom? The Maori. The Maori did not have a written language until the early 19th century, where the chief Hongi Hika and his nephew worked with the linguist Samuel Lee to develop a systematic written form of language. So earlier I have told that it was oral. It was oral. Then, as European settlers arrived, they collected many Maori oral stories. Okay, when the European settlers arrived at New Zealand, what did they do? They collected many Maori oral stories and poems, which were translated into English and published, such as which were those works such as Polynesian mythology by George Gray, Maori fairy tales by Jones Anderson. These stories, such as those about the god Maui, became widely known among the non-Maori population of New Zealand as well as the Maori people. Non-Maori people, so the god that is Maui became widely known among the non-Maori population of New Zealand as well as the Maori people. So let's move to the next slide here. In the 19th century, what happened? Most Pakeha. Now, who are the Pakeha? The Pakeha are the white-skinned non-Maori New Zealand, non-Maori or white-skinned or non-Maori New Zealand people are called Pakeha. They are the white-skinned. So in the 19th century, what happened? Most Pakeha New Zealanders saw themselves as British, and most publications were written by British authors for British audience. It took time for a distinctly New Zealand literature to develop. The first printing press in New Zealand arrived in 1384. So the first in 1834, sorry, in 1834 was the actual date when the first printing press was arrived in New Zealand, and the first book printed as a Maori translation of Catechism in 1830 by William Yeats, Kote Katikaha 3. So this was the thing, this was the work that was translated into English. So it was 1834. The date was very important because for the first time in New Zealand came the printing press. Early New Zealand books were generally narratives of visits and travel. It is very sure. It is very true that in each literature you will find that the early works were the narratives of visits and travel. So in this case, in the case of New Zealand literature as well, it is very true that the early New Zealand books were generally narratives of visits, meaning the traveling and travel to New Zealand, such as a narrative of 9 months residence in New Zealand in 1827 by Augustus Earle, or Station Life in New Zealand by Mary Ann Burker, or scientific works such as the New Zealanders Illustrated, a rare book by natural history artist George French Angus, and a history of the birds of New Zealand ornithologist Walter Buller. So these were the earlier works of New Zealand literature. You can take a screenshot of these slides, or you can also get the PDF by joining my Telegram channel. Okay, early expressions of New Zealand identity in literature included notably Old New Zealand by Pakeha Maori, that is Frederick Edward Manning, and Erwin by Samuel Butler. This work is very familiar. Samuel Butler's Erwin, the setting was New Zealand. Yeah, the Erwin by Samuel Butler, which drew on the author's experience living in Canterbury for 5 years. So the setting was New Zealand. Samuel Butler's Erwin setting. The setting was, it took place in New Zealand. So this was also the earlier work, the experiences of Samuel Butler. that drew on the author's experience of living in Canterbury for 5 years, that is in the New Zealand lands continent, in the continent. Now, Erwin, look at here, that is the Erhun or the Over the Range is a novel by English writer Samuel Butler, first published anonymously in 1872, and that was set in a fictional country that is discovered and explored by the protagonist. The book is a satire on Victorian society. So the Erwin or Over the Range, this is the subtitle of Erhun is Over the Range, and it was a kind of satire on Victorian society that was written by the British novelist Samuel Butler. So and look at here, the first few chapters of the novel, that is the Erwin or the Over the Range, dealing with the discovery of Erwin are in fact based on Butler's own experiences. So these are based on Butler's own experiences in New Zealand, where as a young man he worked as a sheep farmer. As a young man, he worked as a sheep farmer on Mesopotamia station for about 4 years and explored parts of the interior of the South Island and wrote about in his first year in Canterbury settlement. In his first year in Canterbury settlements. So this was the first work. This was a work that was written by Samuel Butler. The novel is one of in the novel that is the Erewhon or Over the Range is one of the first to explore ideas of artificial intelligence as influenced by Darwin's recently published On the Origin of Species that was published in the year 1859, and the machines developed out of the Industrial Revolution. Specifically, it concerned itself in 3-chapter Book of the Machines. So, Book of the Machines with the potentially dangerous ideas of machine consciousness as well as self-replicating machines. Okay. Now again come to the Maoriland movement. The Maoriland movement in the late 19th century or early 20th century, what happened? New Zealand nationalism began to emerge. So the identity of New Zealand nationalism, identity of New Zealand writers, okay, began to emerge with Pakeha writers, with adopting the Maori. Who are the Pakeha writers? The white-skinned writers, the white-skinned people, and the non-Maori and the non-Maori people are Pakeha. Non-Maori New Zealand people are called Pakeha, or the white-skinned people are called Pakeha. Writers, they were adapting what? So they were adapting Maori stories, the myths, the mythology. Yeah. So the term Maoriland proposed and often used as an alternative name for New Zealand around this time, and became the center of a literary movement in which colonialist writers were inspired by and adopted Maori tradition. So the colonialist writers, so they were adopting what? They are adopting the Maori tradition and their stories, their legends. So they were encouraged by a widespread belief among settlers that the Maori were dying race who wouldn't survive contact with Europeans. And Maori themselves were not creators or proponents of the Maori land work. They themselves were not the creators or proponents, rather the Pakeha writers who were adapting, so they were the creators, the proponents of the Maoriland work. For example, Thomas Braken's, he's very important, Thomas Braken's book Musings in Maoriland included the poem that is New Zealand Hymn, which later became one of the two national New Zealand national anthem under the title that is God Defend the New Zealand. God Defend New Zealand. And Bracken and other poets such as J.C. Mackay, Arthur Henry Adams published poems about the Maori Rangitra, that is the Rauh Praha, while Alfred Grace, J.C. Weston, and others wrote fictional short stories and novels with Maori themes. So New Zealand's fourth premier, that is Alfred Domad wrote an epic poem that is, so he wrote an epic poem that is Ranulph and Amoia, a South Sea Day Dream, which is over 1 lakh words long and described a romance between a shipwrecked European man as well as a Maori woman. So let's move to the next slide here. That is early 20th century and early 20th century, that is 1914 to 1939. The New Zealand literature continued to develop in the early 20th century with notable writers including like Blanche Edith Vaughan and the novelists like Jane Mander. So they were the famous writers of that period. New Zealand's most famous and influential writer in these years was the short story writer Catherine Mansfield. So the most famous and the most prestigious, the most famous The most noted writer, third writer, was Catherine Mansfield, who left New Zealand in 1908 and became one of the founders of the literary modernism. She published three collections of short story in her lifetime, that is, In a German Pension, Blees and Other Stories, as well as The Garden Party and Other Stories. So these three was published during his lifetime, during her lifetime, In a German Pension, Blees and Other Stories, and The Garden Party and Other Stories. So here is the Catherine Mansfield, the famous short story writer of New Zealand literature. In the words of C.K. Stead, who has written a biographical novel on Mansfield, C.K. Stead, in the words of C.K. Stead, Mansfield has laid the foundation. What did C.K. Stead say? C.K. Stead has said that Catherine Mansfield has laid the foundations for a reputation that has gone on to grow and influence the development of New Zealand literature ever since. So it was who said this? It was C.K. Stead, and he has written a biographical novel on Mansfield. Another notable early writer was Ursula Bethel. Another notable famous early writer was Ursula Bethel, whose first poetry collection was published in 1929, and her poetry is described by the Oxford Companion to 20th Century Literature in English as having a plainness and spareness as well as freshness of image, which distinguishes it from the more ornamented verse the country had previously produced. So given by Oxford Companion to 20th Century Literature in English. So to whom it was ascribed? It was ascribed to Ursula Bethel, another notable early writer. Watch. So in later years, she wrote about the Ashley River, that is, it was the river that we played there, out of the house, out of the garden, and under the white sky by the Ashley River. So in later years, she wrote of the Ashley River, that is, it was the river we played there, out of the house, out of the garden, out under the white sky by the Ashley River. So Nayo Mars, who divided her time between New Zealand and England, wrote detective fiction in 1930s and was known as one of the queens of crime. So detective fiction as well as also popular at the time by Nayo Mars. Okay, notable works included Man Alone. In that period, okay, notable works included like Man Alone by John Mulligan, an influential classic describing an isolated and alienated New Zealand. Man, which has itself become a cultural stereotype, influenced by Great Depression. Showdown by Margaret Scott. Frank Ferguson's short story collection, A Man and His Wife. These were the notable works during that period by John Mulligan's Man Alone by John Mulligan's, and Showdown by Margaret Scott, Frank Ferguson's short story collection that was A Man and His Wife. Okay, now move to the next slide here. Second World War and subsequent years, that is 1939 to 1960s. Okay, now from 1941, what happened? New Zealand writing gained an international audience. New Zealand writing from 1941, New Zealand writing gained an international audience through John Lehman's periodical Penguin New Writing. It was in the 1950s that, as historian and poet Keith Sinclair said, New Zealand intellect and imagination came alive. New Zealand intellect and imagination came alive. It was told by whom? It was told by Keith Sinclair. Janet Frame's first novel, Owls Do Cry, famous novelist, Owls Do Cry, was published in the year 1957, and she became the most acclaimed and well-known New Zealand novelist of the 20th century. Her work often drew on her experience in psychiatric hospitals and featured stylistic experimentations and explorations of social conditions. So here, Janet Frames is another famous novelist, which Owls Do Cry was a famous novel. Owls Do Cry. Okay. Now move to a new generation of young New Zealand poets eventually emerged, in particular the Wellington group. So there is a kind of New Zealand group of poets, young New Zealand poets eventually emerged, in particular the Wellington group. So name of the group was the Wellington group. What did they reject? What did they reject? They rejected the nationalism of Carnot and the other Caxton poets. Okay. And they argued that New Zealand poets could now focus on universal themes. Okay, they could now focus on universal themes rather than the New Zealand identity. Okay, and James K. Baxter, another famous poet, most famous and prolific of these poets, is widely regarded today as the definitive New Zealand poet. The definitive New Zealand poet is James K. Baxter. Other members of the Wellington groups included Alistair T. Ariki, Campbell, Philor Adcock, and the scholars like C.K. Stead and Vincent O'Sullivan also became well known for their poetry and around this time. So there is the New Zealand poets eventually emerged, in particular the Wellington group of poetry. And now come to the modern literature. Maori and Pacifica writing. Pacific Maori and the Pacifica writing. After the Second World War happened, what happened? Maori began to move into the urban areas. What happened? After the Second World War, the Maori people began to move into the urban areas and had more educational opportunities available there, which led to the emergence of Maori writing in English. In 1964, what happened? Hon Tuhar, the first Maori poet, the first the Maori poet to be distinguished for English poetry, published his first book, that is No Ordinary Son. No Ordinary Son was written by Hon Tuhar, and in 1966, Jack Sturm became the first Maori writer to appear in a major anthology of New Zealand short stories. Authors like Storm, that is Jack Storm, Arfera Blank, Rowley Habib, and Patricia Grace were published for the first time in Te Ao, and Witi Imaria was the first Maori writer to publish a collection of short stories, that is Pounamu Pounamu, that was published in the year 1972, and the first to publish a novel, that is Tangi, in 1973. So it was all about the modern literature. Okay, now move to the next slide here. Kerry Hume, that I have mentioned first, that the first women to receive the Booker Prize, Alan Dove, Kerry Hume, Alan Dove are the best known Maori writers to follow Grace and Imharia. Dove is known for the widely acclaimed Once Were Warriors. Once Were Warriors. Okay. Now, Maori literature is closely connected to Pacific literature because notable the Pacific Islander writers with connections to New Zealand include Albert Wendet, Alistair T. Arki, Campbell, Carlo Miller, John Poole, Lenny Wendet Young, and Courtney Sina Meredith, Oscar Knightley, and Selina Tustela Merce. Wendet is also known for Sons for the Return of Home, and his later novels and short stories collections have formed the foundation for a Pacific literature in English. So this was kind of a brief introduction. So okay, in the next class, even I will take one writer and discuss their important works. So let's talk about the fiction. Notable writers the post second world in the post second world war period include Janet Frame. So Janet Frame, Owen Marshall, Ronald Hugh Morrison, Bill Pearson, Sylvia Aston, A.C. Summers, and in the 1960s, two young novelists like Maurice Sadbold and Maurice Gee both became well known for their traditional, socially realistic novels featuring New Zealand politics and history. Geese, that is Maurice Gee's Plum trilogy continues to be widely read. So Maurice Gee's, okay, his Plum trilogy continues to be widely read, and the first novel, Plum, was voted by literary experts in 2018 to be the best New Zealand novel of the last 50 years. So here, Maurice Gee's Plum trilogy, where the first novel was Plum, it was voted by literary experts in 2018 to be the best New Zealand novel of the last 50 years. And the feminist movement in the 1970s and 1980s was the context for many women writers who emerged in that period, including Fiona Kidman, Marlene Darcourt, and Barbara Anderson, who wrote works exploring and challenging gender roles. So there were some female writers, feminist movement as well in 1970s and 1980s who were writing and exploring challenging the gender roles. Okay, and internationally successful New Zealand writers include Elizabeth Knox, who is known for the Winter's Luck. Elizabeth Knox is known for the Winter's Luck and her other diverse fiction like Emily Perkins, fiction, Fiona Farrell, Damien Wilkins, Nigel Cox, and crime novelists like Paul Cliff. Carrie Hume gained prominence when her novel The Bone People won the Booker Prize in 1985, and she was the first New Zealander and the first debut novelist to win the prestigious award, that is the Booker Prize. Writer Lloyd Jones was shortlisted for his 2007 novel Mr. Peep. So who wrote the novel, that is Mr. Peep? Mr. Peep was written by Lloyd Jones, and Carrie Hume wrote the novel The Bone People. It won him the 1985 Booker Prize. That was published in the year 1984. Okay, shortlisted for his 2007 novel Mr. Peep. In 2013, what happened? Eleanor Catton, another famous novelist, became the second New Zealand winner as well as the youngest winner of the award for her novel The Luminaries. So Eleanor Catton she was also awarded with that prestigious awards, that is that is the Booker Prize for her novel The Luminaries. So who wrote the novel The Luminaries? It was Eleanor Catton, and Lloyd Jones wrote Mr. Peep, and Carrie Hume wrote The Bone People. Now the children's and young adult literature. So Margaret Mahay and Joy Cowley both had their first children books published in 1969. And Moirasgi became well known for his science fiction and fantasy books, notably Under the Mountain. So Moirasgi became very famous for his science fiction novel, that is Under the Mountain and the Half Men of O. Under the Mountain was famous novel fantasy books by Murakami. Okay. Now to the next slide. Poetry. So famous poets like James K. Baxter, Alistair T. Ariki, Campbell, Adcock, C.K. Stead, and Vincent O'Sullivan became well known for their poetry in 1950s as well as in 1960s, with Baxter in particular dominating New Zealand. So James K. Baxter was the famous poet in the 1960s. He was dominating that eras. Now, who were the best playwright at the time? 1960s saw the significant development in New Zealand playwriting, and the country's first professional theatre was Downstage Theatre. So, Downstage Theatre was the country's first professional theatre, opened in Wellington in 1964. Now, Play Market was also founded in 1973 to represent and market New Zealand playwrights and their work. Bruce Mason. So who? Bruce Mason was the country's first professional playwright. Bruce Mason was the New Zealand's first professional playwright. His one-person show, that is The End of the Golden Weather. The End of the Golden Weather, about a boy's loss of innocence in Depression era New Zealand, was performed widely throughout the New Zealand, and he explored the Maori themes and the disintegration of Maori identity in the Pohotkaatri and Awatea. So Bruce Mason was the first country's professional playwright, and his one-person show, that is The End of the Golden Weather, was famous. Now, in 1976, what happened? A group of downstage actors left to found the Sarka Theatre and produced Glide Time by Roger Hall. So another famous playwright was Roger Hall as one of their first production. Greg Mackey's Foreskin's Lament, about a small town rugby culture in New Zealand, likewise achieved iconic status. Drama further developed in the 1980s and 1990s, with new playwrights finding success, including Rennie, Stuart Hone Coke, Briar Grace Smith, and Jane Bennett's feminist play, that is Ophelia. Jane Bates' feminist play, that is Ophelia Thinks Harder. Ophelia Thinks Harder was still widely performed in New Zealand and overseas. Okay. So Jane Bates' feminist play, that is Ophelia Thinks Harder, was still widely performed in New Zealand and overseas. So thank you once again for watching this video. This was a short brief introduction to New Zealand literature. In the next class, I will discuss the important works of important writers. I will take one writer and discuss their important works as well.